Okay, so fantasy fans, it looks like we are getting some new Lord of the Rings posters for the upcoming Lord of the Rings on Prime adaptation, the most expensive season of television ever. I don't know about everyone else, but for me, for every little drip drop driplet we get for the upcoming Lord of the Rings show, my immediate first thought is, what is this going to do for Lord of the Rings? Even if you're not that big of a Lord of the Rings fan, you're probably somewhat invested in the legacy of the franchise because it's so important for the way that fantasy in the mainstream audience is viewed. Lord of the Rings is arguably still the touchstone all these years later for just what you think of when you think fantasy, books or movie adaptations. Now, what about for shows? Just recently we had that title reveal, which I mistakenly thought was CG. Turns out it was nearly entirely practical, which still makes that ending look kind of strange to me, but it showed a devotion that they actually made it to the practical effect. It's a pretty obvious message to fans, and I think we're seeing a similar approach in the costuming we're getting for these posters, because all of these are just up close shots of torsos and hands, and very happily for me, everything looks very touched. I don't know if that sounds weird, but it doesn't look like costumes that were just thrown on. They look worn. They look like they have character beyond just, this will look good fabric. There's story to be had. Whether it's dirt in the hands or just wrinkles in the costuming, it's not like what I criticized in some of the Wheel of Time episodes where it's just too clean. But that's not to say there aren't some people here who don't look kind of clean and polished. There seems to be distinction between where people are coming from, how their civilization is going to allow them to live. And that might just be for the posters, but I'm really hoping that level of detail is actually kept for the show, because it was certainly there in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy movies. Now, we could talk about character speculation constantly. I'm gonna let people who are much more familiar with Lord of the Rings get into that, and instead I want to talk about the aesthetic, especially we're getting in posters that are clearly displaying forms of armament, because we already have been told this is going to be a very Peter Jackson influenced look at the Second Age, which I'm totally fine with. I would rather them just flat out rip off a vision that was quite successful before than try to meander in some direction that fans could be repulsed by, especially with how much Peter Jackson has just influenced how Lord of the Rings, even as just the books, are thought of. But whether it's the elegant curves of this armor, the detailed look of like the faces in this, or the straight up malice that bleeds off here. I've seen a couple people say it's going to be Morgoth. Doubt it. One, this would be an underwhelming presentation of Morgoth, and two, I think it's far more likely to be someone who's from Numenor, possibly just flat out Sauron. There's gonna be a lot of evil people who could embody this, but looking at specifically the sword and gauntlet, there's a level of elegance here in something that could be rather just blunt and brutish that I kind of enjoy. It feels as almost if it's trying to imitate some of the beauty that's coming from the good guys while reveling in its own malice. Such a specific thing for Lord of the Rings that I quite enjoy. Now, one of the things I was looking for in these posters would be some trace or hint of some of the more futuristic technologies that Numenor is accounted to have had. There are certain things within Middle-earth text that are accounts of what they possessed in terms of technology, and it sure does sound like airships or a form of firearm that's able to shoot over grand distances in a super straight line. So as a super Lord of the Rings like nerd, someone who really geeks out about this stuff and thinks it's really neat, I was like, oh, would that be there? But I'm just not seeing any of it, which is probably the smarter choice. It would be very confusing to people who are not familiar with what exactly Numenor is, and instead they could just represent it as super magical and super high and mighty, and you'll basically accomplish the same thing. And what each of these characters is holding is obviously going to be crucially representative of who they are, and the diversity of artifacts really makes me think that we're going to move during this show. We have scrolls, farm equipment, swords, broken swords, just what appear to be small magical items, and rings. Rings, as well as food. Don't neglect the food. Food is important. All of these armaments, though, all these artifacts, they feel so thought out, representative, that puts hope and fear in me. Hope that they are taking the high effort level that really is needed to fully realize the vision that Tolkien created. But there's that pause where it reminds me just how much this show is taking on, and they need to strike this balance narratively that is so efficient in its storytelling, yet actually does allow the viewer to experience all of the gargantuan events happening. And how they're gonna manage to tackle that in the episode limit they have, I have no idea. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the details and artifacts here that you guys want to be getting out into, because I know what you guys actually want, and that's going to be weird random speculation. That's probably going to be wrong because we don't have enough information yet, but let's go ahead and start. Looking at this sword here, it's split down the Hummel. We have one half that looks gold, one half that looks silver. Two trees. You know what that's a reference to. Moving on. Durin. So we have this giant-ass hammer here. Look at it. That's going to be one of the dwarf lords, which lets us know we're going to get a good amount of dwarves. There's also several other posters here that have gold-tipped fingers, clearly referencing more dwarven things. I also think there's going to be a bigger emphasis on the dwarves than we were expecting for the show for this reason. Now, moving on past that, look at the top of it. Seedlings. This could be heavily hinting at some foundational things for Gondor. Switching on over, though, there's this sword that has a pommel with a horsey on it. I immediately saw people being like, Rohirrim, that's too early. It's not Rohirrim stuff. It might be leading to some of the foundations of the Rohirrim, but it's not going to be directly Rohan things. It's very complicated. If you haven't read the Silmarillion, it's going to be weird. I get it. Now, obviously, I think this is young Sauron. It could be one of those, like, more underlings, but to me, this says young Sauron because we know Sauron's been cast in the show, and I'm just saying it now. If you don't give us stupid, sexy Sauron, I'm going to be furious. Sauron should be sexy. He's the shapeshifter. He's the deceiver. Give me that bad boy goth vibes. The continuation of Peter Jackson's vibes is very prevalent, but I'm seeing people in the comments being like, it doesn't remind me of the Lord of the Rings movies. Well, it's a whole other show, and also it's supposed to be a different age. If it had the exact same aesthetic, I would be worried. I will criticize, though, the lighting is something I am still not digging. What is with Amazon adaptations and lighting I do not dig? It's why I think that flat lighting that happened on the thing that they practically made ended up making it look CG. It just adds this like kind of fake effect, and they need to work on how they light things. That's my biggest go ahead and criticism, though. Overall, I like it. Good attention to detail, but it's not honestly the most to judge off of, so we have to kind of let it rest there. You guys wanted goblin vibes, I know you did, so that's the best I could do today. What do you think? So my reaction to these posters is essentially that. I think there's a lot of impressive, really well polished things on display. I'm definitely, as a fan, reveling in the detail, but it acts as a reminder of just how huge this show is going to be and how important the legacy of this franchise is to fans. I love the over-the-top evil and the beauty. I like how this seems to be paying attention to the smaller motivations from the shadow. I want this to succeed. I always want projects like this to succeed. And I certainly feel a lot more positive about this one than I do like the trailer we got for Halo. But I will reserve judgment for now and probably make one of these my phone wallpaper. But anyway, everyone, let me know what you thought of the Lord of the Rings posters in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and check out my books Breach of Peace and Rebel's Creed if you need something to add to your TBR. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.